Liquidator coming back with breaking news, hot off the press. So it looked like WNBA players has agreed to Cathy Engelbert's 30-day stint.
What's happening in the WNBA right now feels like history in motion. For weeks, fans, players, and even league executives have been walking on eggshells, waiting to see whether the league would spiral into a full-scale lockout or find a way to hold things together. And just when it looked like things were about to collapse, news broke. An unexpected 30-day extension between the WNBA and Commissioner Cathy Engelbert. It wasn't just a technical delay, it was a lifeline. That one decision changed the trajectory of the entire league, pulling it back from the edge of uncertainty. For many, this was more than an agreement. It was a signal that both sides understood what was truly at stake: the survival and future of women's professional basketball in America. Imagine this: a growing league finally stepping into the spotlight after years of struggle. Ratings are climbing, ticket sales are rising, and media attention is bigger than ever. But behind all the applause, there's a power struggle that's been quietly brewing for months. Players demanding fairer pay, better conditions, and real respect for their talent, while the league's leadership tries to balance ambition with financial reality. When the first reports of a possible lockout surfaced, it sent shockwaves across the sports world. How could a league that's finally gaining momentum risk it all with a shutdown? It wasn't just about contracts. It was about credibility, growth, and the image of a league fighting to prove it belongs on the same stage as the NBA, the NFL, or any major sport. Then came the turning point. Reports from insiders revealed that players had agreed to give negotiations one last chance. 30 more days. 30 days to rewrite the future, or risk losing everything they've built. It wasn't a win or a loss. It was a truce, a temporary pause in a battle that's far from over. And make no mistake, this extension isn't a sign of peace. It's a sign of strategy. Both sides know the real fight lies ahead. The WNBA is standing at a crossroads, balancing between progress and peril. Each move from here on will shape what kind of league this becomes, not just for the stars who dominate the headlines, but for every player who dreams of making it to the top. This story isn't just about basketball. It's about power, identity, and the value of women in sports. It's about a league trying to define its future in a world finally paying attention. And as the calendar ticks closer to November 30th, every fan, every player, and every critic is asking the same question: what happens next? Because this isn't just another labor dispute. It's the moment that will determine whether the WNBA's rise continues or collapses under the weight of its own growing pain. Behind closed doors, the mood was tense. The stakes had never been higher, and both sides knew it. Every word, every clause, every number on the table carried the weight of an entire sport's future. Players wanted change, not in theory, but in reality: better contracts, real revenue sharing, and a new structure that reflected their rising influence. For years, the WNBA has operated under a careful balance, pushing for growth, but always constrained by limited resources. The players knew that. They lived it. They traveled it. They felt the grind of long seasons, small salaries, and limited recognition, even as their games grew more popular. This time, they weren't coming to the table quietly. They came with leverage, confidence, and a growing awareness that the world was finally watching. The league, on the other hand, had its own fears. A lockout could be catastrophic. The WNBA is still expanding its audience, still proving its profitability to networks and sponsors. Any disruption now could undo years of progress. The executives understood the risk. They needed to maintain stability, keep the headlines positive, and avoid giving critics any reason to doubt the league's future. When the first reports hit social media that a deal was being discussed, it sent a wave of cautious optimism across the basketball community. Sports reporters described it as a strategic pause, a brief but crucial window for both sides to regroup. Extending talks by 30 days wasn't just an act of diplomacy, it was a message. The WNBA and its players weren't ready to walk away from the table. But make no mistake, the tension didn't disappear. The deeper the discussions went, the clearer it became. that this wasn't a simple contract renewal. It was a fundamental power shift. The league had always held the upper hand, but the players, now with more financial independence, growing fan bases, and powerful brands, were beginning to rewrite the rules. Inside the negotiations, voices were strong and unwavering. Player representatives argued that it was time to stop treating professional women athletes like they were running a charity. They pointed out the numbers, the sold-out arenas, the sponsorships, the social media traction. They weren't just filling a gap in sports. They were building a movement. And yet, even with all the progress, there were challenges. The league's finances were still fragile. Every decision had to be weighed against sustainability. What could the WNBA realistically afford? What demands could it meet without risking long-term growth? The answers weren't easy. Still, one thing was undeniable. This was no longer the same WNBA from a decade ago. Players had options. They had voices that resonated far beyond the court. The rise of stars with mainstream appeal had changed everything. And among them, one name stood taller than all the rest: Caitlin Clark. Her presence loomed large over the negotiations, even if she wasn't directly in the room. The moment she stepped into the league, viewership soared, media interest exploded, and fans who had never watched a WNBA game before suddenly cared. Her popularity wasn't just a story, it was leverage. Everyone in the room knew that if the league wanted to sustain its newfound attention, it needed to make sure the players, the stars, felt valued. Because the truth is, fans don't follow organizations. They follow people. And in 2025, the people defining the WNBA were rewriting what power looked like. That's what made this 30-day extension so critical. It wasn't a delay born from hesitation. It was born from necessity. Both sides needed time to figure out how to coexist in this new era. An era where players are brands, where social media drives engagement, and where influence isn't just measured in stats, but in followers, sponsorships, and cultural impact. The decision to keep talking until November 30th was more than a business move. It was a reflection of a league on the verge of transformation. Everyone involved understood that this wasn't just about keeping the season alive. It was about creating a blueprint for the next decade. As the news spread, the basketball world reacted with a mix of relief and curiosity. Relief that the league wasn't shutting down, and curiosity about what the next deal would look like. What would change? What would stay the same? And, more importantly, who would benefit most when the dust finally settled? Because beneath all the optimism, a quiet question lingered. Could unity last long enough to create something truly groundbreaking? Or was this extension simply delaying an inevitable confrontation? The league had bought itself time, but time has a price. And as the days ticked by, one thing became increasingly clear. The real battle was just beginning. When Caitlin Clark stepped into the WNBA, she didn't just bring her jump shot, she brought an entire cultural shift. Overnight, the league's visibility skyrocketed. Ticket sales broke records. Television ratings shattered long-standing ceilings. Sponsors who had once ignored the WNBA were suddenly writing seven-figure checks. But with that rise came something the league hadn't fully prepared for: power. Not the kind controlled by front offices or executives, but the kind that comes from public influence, from millions of fans rallying behind players instead of teams. And at the center of that new power dynamic stood Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. Their rivalry had started long before the pros, but in the WNBA, it evolved into something bigger, something the media couldn't resist. Clark's clean-cut image and precision play contrasted sharply with Reese's fiery confidence and unapologetic swagger. Together, they ignited conversations that transcended basketball. They weren't just athletes. They were cultural figures commanding national attention. Behind the scenes, executives began to realize what that meant. When Clark spoke, headlines followed. When Reese reacted, social media exploded. The narrative wasn't being written by the league anymore. It was being driven by the players. This wasn't the first time athletes had taken control of their sport, but in the WNBA, it was unprecedented. The players were no longer content to be spokespeople. They were becoming stakeholders in their own destinies. And with each new endorsement deal, Each viral moment, their leverage grew. Inside the negotiations, that power shift was palpable. League officials tried to remind everyone of financial reality, small markets, modest TV contracts, long-term sustainability. But the players came armed with proof that things were changing. They pointed to Clark's jersey sales, which outsold multiple NBA players. They highlighted Reese's social media engagement, which rivaled top-tier influencers. They cited attendance numbers that had never been seen before. The message was clear. We are the product now. It wasn't arrogance, it was awareness. The players finally understood that they held the keys to the league's future. Without them, the WNBA couldn't sell out arenas, draw new fans, or sustain the momentum that had taken years to build. As the media frenzy intensified, it became obvious that this wasn't just a negotiation. It was a redefinition of power. The WNBA's traditional model was built on collective growth. But now, the individual was just as valuable as the institution. The league couldn't afford to alienate its stars, especially not when their personal brands were driving record attention. And yet, that's exactly where the tension lay. How do you balance the growth of individual icons with the stability of an entire league? How do you manage egos, sponsorships, and media narratives when each player's platform is bigger than the organization itself? Behind the curtain, some executives worried that the league was losing control of its own story. Every controversy, every tweet, every disagreement between players and officials became front-page news. The WNBA's carefully crafted image of unity was beginning to crack. Still, for many fans, this was the most exciting time in the league's history. The drama, the competition, the rivalries, it all made the WNBA feel alive in a way it never had before. For the first time, it wasn't just about basketball. It was about identity, pride, and the right to define success on their own terms. Caitlin Clark's calm determination contrasted perfectly with Angel Reese's electric energy, creating a dynamic that mirrored the league's internal struggle. Order versus disruption, tradition versus transformation. And as they continued to dominate headlines, one truth became undeniable. This new generation of players wasn't waiting for permission to lead. They were taking the spotlight and shaping the narrative themselves. In that moment, the WNBA crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a league trying to prove it belonged. It had become a platform where players could build empires. Every dunk, every rivalry, every viral interview added another layer to the growing realization that the balance of power had shifted permanently. This was the climax the league both feared and needed, a moment where everything that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Because now, the question wasn't whether the WNBA could survive. It was whether it could evolve fast enough to keep up with the players who had outgrown the old system. As the final days of the 30-day extension ticked away, tension inside the WNBA reached a fever pitch. The league offices buzzed with uncertainty, while locker rooms grew quiet, guarded, and filled with whispers. What had begun as routine negotiations had turned into an emotional battlefield. Leaks began to spill. Anonymous sources hinted that some of the biggest stars were ready to walk away if progress stalled. Others claimed certain owners were pushing back hard against the players' growing influence. Social media became a war zone, fans taking sides, rumors flying faster than facts, and every comment from Caitlin Clark or Angel Reese dissected like a political statement. What no one saw, however, was the exhaustion. Behind the public smiles and press conferences, players were mentally drained. They had carried the league on their backs all season, fighting for wins on the court and fairness off it. Every interview, every tweet, every soundbite felt like a move in a high-stakes chess game where one wrong word could shift public opinion. Meanwhile, Commissioner Cathy Engelbert faced her toughest test yet. She wasn't just negotiating a deal. She was trying to preserve the soul of the league. Insiders described long nights, endless calls, and meetings that stretched into the early hours of the morning. The WNBA's future was being decided in boardrooms filled with tension, ambition, and fear. the leaks only added to the chaos. Reports suggested that the players' union was pushing for higher revenue shares and stronger benefits, while owners worried about the financial strain of a rapidly expanding league. Then came the whispers that shook everything. A rumor that several stars were considering sitting out future games if the next agreement didn't meet expectations. The media pounced, framing it as a rebellion. But in reality, it was something deeper, a declaration of worth. For years, the WNBA had asked its players to be patient, to trust the process, to wait for the growth to come. Now, those players were done waiting. Behind the scenes, a few veterans reportedly became the voices of reason, urging unity and calm. They reminded the younger stars that every great change comes with conflict, and that their fight wasn't just for themselves. It was for every future player who would dream of stepping onto that court. The drama reached its peak when a confidential memo leaked, outlining potential contingency plans if negotiations failed. The idea of canceled games, empty arenas, and halted progress sent shockwaves through the sports world. Sponsors called for updates, networks demanded clarity, and fans flooded social media with one question: was the WNBA really about to break apart just as it was reaching its prime? But in the middle of the storm, something remarkable happened. Instead of fracturing, the players closed ranks. Angel Reese publicly posted a message calling for solidarity. Caitlin Clark echoed it days later, saying that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Those moments changed the tone. The headlines softened. The public began to see not chaos, but courage. The players weren't divided. They were determined, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Negotiators returned to the table with renewed purpose. The tone shifted from confrontation to collaboration. It wasn't easy. Trust had been damaged. Tempers had flared. But the desire to protect what they'd built outweighed the differences that threatened to tear it apart. By the time the final week of the extension arrived, something had shifted in the air. No one knew what the final deal would look like. But one thing was clear: the WNBA would never be the same. The power dynamics had changed forever. Players had proven that their voices could not be silenced, that their worth could not be ignored, and that their influence extended far beyond the court. What began as a crisis had become a revolution. As the curtain slowly fell on one of the most dramatic months in league history, fans around the world held their breath. Would this be the moment the WNBA stepped fully into its future? Or would it crumble under the weight of its own evolution? No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: the league's future was now in the hands of its players. And they weren't backing down. When the dust finally settled, the WNBA stood on the edge of something entirely new. The chaos, the leaks, the tension, it had all led to this moment of reckoning. But it wasn't destruction. It was transformation. Across the league, you could feel the shift. What began as a contract dispute had evolved into a statement of identity. The players weren't just employees anymore. They were architects of the game's future. They had fought for their value, for their dignity, and for the generations that would follow in their footsteps. And maybe that's what this whole battle was really about. Not just money or media deals, but legacy. The understanding that the WNBA isn't simply a league, it's a movement built by women who refuse to be overlooked. Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Breanna Stewart, Aja Wilson, each of them, in their own way, became symbols of something greater. They didn't just play the game, they reshaped it. Their voices, their rivalries, their boldness forced the world to watch, to listen, and to finally respect the power of women's sports. In boardrooms, the message had landed. Networks began preparing larger broadcast packages. Sponsors expanded their partnerships. The momentum was no longer hypothetical. It was measurable, undeniable, unstoppable. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the shift of perception. Little girls now pointed to the screen and saw heroes who looked like them, spoke like them, and stood their ground with unshakable pride. And for every critic who once doubted the league's staying power, there were millions of new fans proving them wrong. The WNBA's rebirth didn't come through silence. It came through struggle, through a chorus of voices that refused to fade. In a way, That's the beauty of this story. Growth never comes peacefully. It comes through friction, through challenge, through standing up and saying, "We deserve better." And now, as the league moves forward into its next chapter, the echoes of that fight remain. The 30-day extension might have been a pause in the battle, but it became something bigger, a symbol of resilience, of unity, of faith in a future they refused to surrender. Caitlin Clark continues to draw crowds wherever she plays. Angel Reese continues to speak fearlessly, embodying a confidence that defines a new era. The two of them, once rivals, now represent the same truth. The WNBA belongs to the players. Always has. Always will. From the outside, it might look like just another sports league trying to survive. But anyone who's followed this story knows it's more than that. It's a fight for equality, for recognition, for a seat at the table in a world that's long underestimated women's power to lead, to inspire, and to change everything. The season ahead will test them again. Negotiations will continue, opinions will clash, and the spotlight will grow hotter. But something fundamental has shifted. The WNBA isn't chasing relevance anymore. It's commanding it. And when history looks back, this moment, the extension, the near lockout, the rise of Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese will be remembered not as a crisis, but as the turning point that redefined women's basketball forever. The league didn't break. It evolved. And the women who built it stood taller than ever, reminding the world that progress is never handed down. It's earned, one fearless step at a time.